Whether you're looking for a convenient refresher course, or a way to earn your pragmatic certification at your own speed, or the chance to take a pragmatic course from your specific corner of the world, then Foundations on Demand is the solution you need. Get the same great content, tools, and templates our Foundations course is famous for in a flexible and easy-to-use online learning platform. Learn the skills you need to build and market products people want to buy. And earn your Pragmatic Institute certification anywhere, anytime. No more travel worries, no more time zone issues, just truly great training. Experience the new way of training with Foundations on Demand from Pragmatic Institute. Visit pragmaticinstitute.com/foundations to learn more.
And with that, Sandi, I've got a bio here. Let me just read the official bio so folks know who you are. Sandi Olson, Senior Marketing Content Manager at Microsoft. I've heard of that. Sandi is an agile, data-driven creative who believes in being customer-focused and delivering innovative and strategic content that communicates value. In today's fast-paced environment, Sandi remains dedicated and most passionate about connecting with customers, communicating this value, and moving marketing plans forward. We all want to do that, Sandi. Can you give us some tips today specifically on asset assessment to help us achieve that goal? I'm going to turn the time over to you, and I'll pop in with questions here and there as they come up, but the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much, Eddie. Appreciate all the ramping up and getting us all set for this conversation. So we will start the official, front page. How asset assessment can help you outmaneuver the competition. And the general thing that we're going to be talking about, how to approach asset assessment, utilizing assessment to better integrate positioning and messaging, how healthy asset hygiene enhances strategy development. My three favorite words, archive, and tools and processes are going to close out the end. But before I jump into it, I want to make sure that we have a quick taxonomy. As we talked about, I'm from Microsoft. Microsoft has a tendency to really be enthusiastic about our very own acronyms. So I want to make sure that what I'm talking about is universal to the entire audience. And the first one is assets, materials, and content. And those three are relatively interchangeable. I've been in environments where asset tends to be what is used when talking about all the things when we're at an agency that is working on both digital and print materials. Material generally comes from places that do physical items. So that could be a bus ad or, physical walking deck, printouts, that type of thing. And then content, I see that more often in digital only or digital first environment. So that's your websites, your emails, that type of thing. But realistically, all three of them mean generally the same thing. They just mean all the things that you make to sell your product or service. And I'll be using them somewhat interchangeably during the course of this conversation. Going right along with all the things, the BOM, the bill of materials, and that's just the list of all of the assets that are associated with whatever sort of frame of reference you have. So if we're talking about maybe an in-house creative team, and they have the BOM is everything that in-house creative team makes for their entire product or service. Whereas an ad agency that has 50 clients may have the BOM for client A. So it is as big or as small as it needs to be within the context of the broadest scope of what you're talking about, but it's the list of all the things. The SME, the subject matter expert, the one thing that's important to remember with content development in general is that the person who's creating the content is the SME, is the subject matter expert in developing content. But what that content is likely going to have a lot of other people in the company that they're responsible for understanding and really having a deeper dive into those specific channels. So we want to make sure that we integrate whatever we're doing with the SMEs that have that expertise in the multiple subjects that you're going to be communicating. C-suite is just a shorthand for everybody at the very highest level of the company, the CEO, CIO, CFO, et cetera. And sprint, for those working in an agile workflow environment, there aren't very many design or creative spaces that are sprint or that are agile, but there are some. And there are definitely some places where if it's a software company that is adamantly agile and they incorporate this workflow mechanism even through their creative team. And a sprint is just, what that means is items will go live on a certain cadence, on a certain set schedule. And a sprint is all of the things that are in the current or a specific section of time. So if your team maybe is a web team and you push updates every Tuesday and Thursday, then there'll be the sprint for Tuesday and the sprint for Thursday. And keeping track of those is based very much on timeline. It won't necessarily mean for larger projects, a sprint might not necessarily, or something in a sprint might not necessarily be a completed final publishable item. It's just the thing that was done at that point to move forward. So moving on. So how to approach asset assessment. First thing is, what have you got? What is your current traffic flow from concept to approval, to build, to launch, to archive? How are things currently working? Are you starting from very few people are starting from a completely blank slate. So are you starting with a system that has some structure, but maybe it's not documented, but people generally kind of know it? Okay, well, what exactly is that? What happens if someone has a great idea for an asset that needs to be built? How does that move through the process all the way from that concept to the end? And then where do people go when they want to look at what already exists? Is there a central folder where all live assets currently in the market exist? Or do people have their own little fiefdoms and you have to know that Joe over here is the person who has some authority over the last campaign, that they happen to have been the project manager for that. So you have to go ask Joe where the files for that is, because he has to walk you through that path in your digital landscape. And then what's the review cadence of your asset library? Do folders just exist while you're building and then it goes live and then the folder is wherever it happened to be when it went live? Or is there actually a system or process for containing those assets and aligning all the images, et cetera, et cetera? Do you push everything specifically to an archive folder, or is the archive folder just kind of the base of it where you've thrown everything? The other big thing to consider too is, who are the people invested in asset management? So are you the only person who manages this stuff? And some smaller creative teams, definitely there's one person who's generally the go-to person when you need a file from last week, last month, last year, whatever. Others, there's a whole project management organization. Maybe there's an administrative team, and maybe it's the wild, wild west. There really isn't anyone who owns it, and anybody could be in charge of anything, and well, best of luck, soldier. Those do exist in remarkably successful companies. And who owns, for whatever things that you might have influence over, who owns those? Are you the person who owns them? Are you potentially pushing a rock up a hill in your drive for better asset assessment? Or is there already an existing buy-in to the idea that there's maybe gold that can be found in existing assets or in your asset archive? And is there anyone in your team that is tasked with knowing what content is currently out in the world at any given moment? If you have our social media campaign, we just released a tweet that has a really embarrassing typo. Is there a clear line of sight for who it is that can go and find that file or switch it out or something? So does that structure already exist within the teams that you're working with? And is it readily available to know who on the team actually has that information? Another thing to consider is the stuff. Are there consistent or recurring gaps in your marketing materials? Is your data analysis seeing a regular dip in certain times or in certain conversations? Are you seeing where your audience is not engaging with specific topics, and you feel that you would be better served, your product or service would be better served if there was more engagement with those specific hits to the market? Are you hearing feedback from any of your frontline teams, the people who are directly interacting with your customers, that they're receiving the same questions or comments about your products? Are they regularly getting feedback? Are you regularly getting feedback that there is a gap in the information that is being presented out there? In the role that I'm in right now, what I work on is very technical. So it's often not a question of how hard can I sell a thing, and we need marketing materials to help sell the thing, to help convince people of the value of it. For the most part, it's we need marketing material that helps explain this very technical thing, where it fits in their needs, where we might be able to answer questions that they have, or fill needs that they have, because the information is so complex. So if you see gaps in that, then that's an important opportunity to sort of review what you've got and where it should be. And just for the official assessment for integrating positioning and messaging, and I'll read this is the sort of generic definition of the purpose of messaging and positioning statement. And I'll just read it out for you. The messaging and positioning framework provides overarching context and guidance for all messaging about the company or program and its value to potential customers or partners. This framework, including the high-level messaging, pillars, and supporting points, should serve as a starting point when discussing or developing content for or about the program. It's not necessary to use the content verbatim. This messaging can be adjusted to reflect the tone of any scenario, so long as it remains in line with the company style and voice. And the MPF can be for the entire company, or it can be for a specific product. Again, with Microsoft, I work on a channel of the offerings. I'm not talking about the broader Microsoft messaging and positioning statement, although I'm sure that they do have it. So it's a requirement to make sure that everything that you possess or everything that you produce does have some sort of a structure, overarching structure to it. I know that there's going to be a future conversation specifically about messaging and positioning, so I won't dig too deep into that, but just know that that is definitely an important part of this conversation. And is the MPF, is it referenced during the concepting stage of a new asset? And it's great to go through the exercise of developing an MPF and making sure that anybody who has contributing elements to your pieces, to the work that you produce, has some familiarity with that. But the exercise is wasted if you go through the process and then it gets filed away and no one really sees it. And it's unfortunate that doing the thing and then filing it away and no one ever looking at it again is actually really common. So, circling back around to the title of this presentation, we're talking about what you can do to outshine your competition. Your competition may have an MPF, but they may have just put it off in the dust and no one even knows where it is. But they did do the thought process on it, but they couldn't reference it again if their life depended on it. And in the other extreme, don't be so fully anchored to it that you've got the specific lines that you use each time over and over again, because your audience will stop seeing it or processing it as new information. So you definitely want to have it, keep it fresh, and keep it sort of the general sense of things, but not anchored to it specifically. So how can healthy asset hygiene enhance your strategy development? So we all know that we ought to manage our marketing assets, but few teams or companies actually do it. It's the thing we all intend to do, but when push comes to shove, they don't. So if you are really excellent at this, you will have access to all of the things that you've done in the past that when you're in the moment of concepting will really help you to make a much stronger creative, because you'll already have the reference material for what you've had before. You don't have to have it on top of mind. You can just go back into the files and have an easy, quick refresher on what's been happening with any given product or campaign, and it's right there and ready for you to remind yourself or reconsume it as needed. And the other one, next one is, I can't tell you the number of times someone who, the founder of the company or someone who's been around for a long time will say, oh, hey, we did this thing back in, 93, and it involved this icon that was really cool, and I want to bring this back again, or couldn't we do something with that? And you weren't there in 93. You have no idea what they're talking about. But if you have an asset program that is structured and organized, you can find at least reference to what that dude is talking about. So that's really handy to be able to have that and not just blow your entire day trying to chase down something that happened last month, last year, whatever, that you just don't have top of mind. And I hate to be the bearer of bad news. There aren't really a lot of brand new ideas. There kind of shouldn't be for a lot of reasons. There's the reason you have a messaging and positioning framework is to give yourself some parameters about how you talk about what you want to talk about and what you want to talk about when you're communicating your product or service. And so everything that you are creating is kind of fitting within those bumpers. So knowing what you've already done in the past and having a sense of where there is space or where things have evolved is a really good idea. And speaking of evolving, a real easy way to go back and look at what you've done over time is to go back and check your archive. Oh, at this point we did this. At this point we did this. This is what we call this campaign. And some of those things, everyone likes a well-placed throwback. Everyone likes to be reminded, especially your most devoted customers. They really like the subtle throw to, oh, you're one of the cool kids. You've known us since way back when. Even if way back when is, we're talking TikTok, so way back when is 3 hours ago. So having access to a lot of that is really going to be really useful for you. When is a good time to take some time to meander through the archives? One of them is as you're prepping to brainstorm for next year's big ideas. Like I said, there's not really brand new ideas, but it's so much easier to come up with the next great idea when you're not staring at a blank piece of paper. And the way to not stare at a blank piece of paper is to go back through the archives and just highlight, oh, I kind of remember this. Let me open up this walking deck. Let me open up this chart. Oh, I remember this. Hey, these things were really beneficial to what we were trying to communicate at the time. We might be able to take a piece of this and rework it for our next year's big idea. Or maybe, it's the Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, the side characters of a major play. Bring them out. Maybe they deserve to be the main characters of their own play. And easy and clear access to the archives helps your analysts connect customer behavior to the specific campaigns. So another good time to work through the archives is when you're looking back at your analysis. Make sure that you can actually compare when you had the spikes, either up or down, and what was out there at the time, and have a real clear sense of what you were communicating and how you were communicating it. The next one is if you have to rush to get a message out, but your legal team or your partner company doesn't seem to feel the same urgency. So you have to pass something through legal. And one example that comes to my mind is when I was working at an agency, and it was in telecom. We had to push something through that included an offer for Apple products. And iPhones Apple is notoriously very possessive about their brand, with good reason. But in order for us to turn this around very quickly to their legal team to get their approval, we said, hey, here's where we did this before. Here's where we used the exact same phrasing about this specific product within this broader campaign. So all you are approving now is that this is still a thing that you have already approved that is still okay. And that can sometimes turn them around much more quickly so you're not bogged down with them. So knowing that you've already used those phrases is really beneficial. And next, like I said, my three favorite words: archive, archive, archive. So I want to talk a little bit about how you actually structure your archive. And there needs to be naming conventions and folder naming conventions and file naming conventions in order to make your archive as accessible to as wide a range of people as possible. So there's no one completely right answer. There's always going to be bits and pieces relative to exactly what works for you and your team. So these are just suggestions, but these are some of the ones that have worked really well for me. And one, the folder structure, if your organization functions by campaign, if it's one campaign after the next, and generally the community of people who would care about your files will reference things by their campaign, then this is a great opportunity. This is a great way to structure those files. And one of the reasons that I have this highlighted, the date, the biggest challenge that as an American that I have with this is you actually want it to be the date to be day, month, year, not month, day, year. And the only reason for that is for anything, if you have a situation where you have multiple files, you want to make sure that you've got the most recent one. And the way to get the most recent one on a day-to-day basis is that you go from smallest collection of information out to widest collection of information. So that means it has to be day, month, year. And even while creating this, I had to go back in and correct myself. So this one, don't let this be a hill that you die on. It may be harder to do because our brains we weren't trained this way, but know that is the motivation for having the date set like that. Another variable to this that's worth considering is I find that it's really useful to have one folder that is the source of truth of everything that is out in the world. So if a thing has been published, especially if much of your work is published to the outside world, if you're not doing internal documents as much as external ones, have a designated place where if this thing is on your website, this is the folder it will live in. And that quick and easy ability to jump in and see what's actually live in the world. And then follow that with the next step is all of the iterations of that. So all of the history of it, all of where you went, maybe if that C-suite I mentioned earlier says something about something that was, the thing that didn't go live on our website in fall of 2020 because we changed things rapidly and went with something completely different. But I want to bring that back because I think now's a good time for it. Well, that would be here in this folder structure, looking at it by date or looking at it by campaign. Another sort of cheat that I've used, you see the name, the number here, the 01, 02, and I use that in order to tie the final file name to the folder that goes with it. And it's just, it's a hierarchy. So it's whatever if alphabetical works fine for you, by all means, just go with alphabetical. But because you can't force most file organization structures outside, then outside of that alphabetical structure, if you wanted to force it into a different organization than 01, 02, 03, obviously if you have, 150 things, that might prove more challenging. But for individual campaigns, having that number at the very beginning as well. And yeah, I happen to notice Chris's point there, year, month, day works just as well. And yes, that is absolutely true. So another one that I tend to favor is organized by product. And again, that's a great one if you're working with a really wide team and have, your separate entities are based on product. If you have a team that only works on biz apps as a product, then, the top level folder would be biz apps. From there, then date might be the easiest organizational structure. So, and by date, I mean the fiscal quarters, and then sort of tapering it down from there. And the third is organized by launch date or by sprint. And this one is, again, if your organization is much more focused on dates, then you organize by date. But then make sure that you have all of that information and have a clear delineation of subject matter rolling down from there. So this seems like because this can be kind of wonky, this seems like a good place to stop and see if there are any questions specifically about folder structure.
Just the one so far, Sandi, which is assuming that your company has the freedom to choose any of these three, because we're not locked into anything yet, or maybe it's just Wild West out there, as you said. Any advantages in one over the other? Do certain systems give you access to information that others don't, as far as, going by campaign or data sprint or product?
Right. Honestly, the least useful to my mind is the date or the sprint. The most useful is kind of depending on the parameters of your group. If you are like, right now, the organization that I'm with, most of the work that I produce, we aren't really going campaign by campaign. It's this rolling evolution of how better can we explain our product, and then the product has slight revisions to it. So we just released a whole new set of documents to acknowledge an update in how we deliver benefits and how our customers can receive benefits. And so organizing by campaign wouldn't really do anything, because the campaign is, FY23 benefits update. That doesn't, 5 years from now, I'm not necessarily going to remember exactly which benefits came up at this point. Whereas if I'm organized by product, then I am going to say, oh, this is for the BizApps partner program, or that type of thing. So for me, and where I am right now, product is absolutely, organized by product is absolutely the better option. But in previous roles that have been straight agency work, campaign makes a lot of sense, because everything that I did when I worked at, agency X was with company Y for this product, so that there wasn't a sufficient filtering to it. The refining and the bulk of the work that we did was we would come out with new campaigns on a regular basis. So yeah, there are a lot of places that will say that they are agile that really aren't truly agile. And that's some of the reason why the launch date / sprint is not as useful. And also the date, unless the actual date, like if you're releasing things on D-Day or something like that, where the specific date is relative to the content of the work, the date is going to be tracks the least. Because what we want to be able to do is look at, a folder with 25 line items and be able to quickly line out, oh, it's this one. We're talking about the BizApps product. We're talking about the campaign for new releases or whatever it is. Being able to eyeball that and say, I am now looking at the line item that is the correct line item for the thing that I think I want to find.
Good. A couple more questions coming into the Q&A. They're specifically related to this slide, I believe. Do you want to take these?
Yeah, let's go ahead and
on it here. Okay.
Yeah.
Doug asks, what if you have a sales enablement or content management system where assets reside and are eventually archived? File naming is less obvious there. Any thoughts about asset organization?
Yeah, I mean, depends on how forced your archiving is, and how well calibrated that archiving is with your actual workflow. So are you in a situation where you want to be able to go back and reference something and it's not there anymore because you've got that forced archiving, in which case it may require a little bit of extra work to, at the very least, get your final file and put it into a specific saved archive folder that you can manually go in and access from there. So sort of
sounds like there's a difference between an archive and a black hole.
right.
You're just trying to free up space on the server, right? That's not the point here. You should be able to access, to get into this archive, to process it somehow, to learn information from the past that you can apply to your future work is the whole point. And if you can't do that, it's not a productively set up archive, right? Doug, I hope that helped a little bit. Corey posted a similar but very interesting question. Any advice for companies that have different SharePoint sites per department or different levels of access across the sites? What are some best practices to ensure an asset that lives across multiple departments is all up to date across different SharePoint sites? We've got, I think the buzzword is siloing going on here with Corey, right? How do we deal with that?
Yeah, a dry sense of humor and a lot of patience. That's how to deal with it. No. So in situations like that, where feels like there's just been a little bit of chaos, one of the things that I actually like doing is holding on to that BOM, that bill of materials, and that is a straight up spreadsheet. And in that straight up spreadsheet, you have links to all of the different things. So if you use your BOM as a cheat sheet for how to get things, then it can unpack that a little bit more within the BOM so that you have those links. Now, obviously, if you have security issues where you are in charge of this silo and are not in charge of this silo, so you can't get access to this silo, that's going to present its own problems. And I don't have a great solution for that. But certainly, the harder it is to archive, the more intentional you have to be in the archiving process, even to the point of, like I said, having your own spreadsheet that is a cheat sheet of what is relevant to you or what campaigns are most relevant to you. And in different pages within that cheat sheet that has the links to the things. And one thing that I definitely enjoy, that definitely will do on some of these. You see, I use the example in the organized by launch date. I've got the first item is 2 underscores and then product BOM. So if you need to have your BOM or have your cheat sheet live in a folder. So for example, you would have maybe taking the BOM, taking the individual file, and you put it in organized by product. So you have this general file structure, but you've got that product BOM as the first item. Now, obviously, a lot of folder structures, they're going to put the folders first, and then they're going to put the individual files. So it may be at the bottom of the page, but if you're organized, then you can scroll. But holding on to that, and with that 2 underscores to make sure that it is the first thing to show up, no matter what it's called. And then click on that, open that, have that as the reference, and perhaps have that show the links to where everything else might be.
Right. Yeah. To give Corey a little hope there, I would submit that if we manage our own silos in a way that is giving us these promised results, that eventually people will notice, and you'll be able to expand these methods into the greater company because they see the value of a well-organized archive.
Yeah. That is absolutely the experience that I've had in previous roles, where if I put together a clear organization of the whatever I was doing, others would see it and appreciate it. And there's 1,000 different ways to organize. This is why I can't give you an absolute, this is the right answer. But simply being intentional and being clear about what that organizational structure is really going to make a huge difference.
Right. One last note from Maureen in the chat here, and then I'll let you go on, Sandy, but Maureen had a great idea here. One thing we've done is put everything in a flat file structure, use a common file name structure, and then in SharePoint, utilize tags so that people can search and find things. So yeah, common naming structure, standard naming structure, but then all you need, I suppose, would be a key to what tags you've used, and then you can search and you can find things that way as well. Cool idea, Maureen.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's absolutely a very useful option as well. As long as there is some organization and structure around what those tags are. Because if you've got one tag that is walking deck and another tag that is walking decks, then you've got
Right.
two tags, and that's not as useful. So and sometimes that's a user management thing that can be worth the time, but does take some time and energy.
Mm-hmm.
And very much along the same thought process when we look at file naming conventions. And this is, again, I'm a big fan of the final folder. That means, no, really, everything in here is final. Now, the only variable here is that you want to make sure you have the right information, that if you send this as a link to someone, that they will understand the context of that link. So this is why you would have to include the date, the program, the campaign, and the asset. You can't just say walking deck on this, because even though you have all that information, as you scroll down in the file names, you still need to clearly state what it is so that someone just getting it as an email without any other context, without seeing the folder that it's in, will be able to see what it is and why they should care about it.
Now, just to make myself feel better, be honest, have you ever named a file final, or final version? Asking for a friend.
By that time, the word that starts with an F is usually not final.
Okay. Fair enough.
Actually, there is definitely been times when I've had something that is called final that is in the not final folder, but being actually pretty rigid about what is allowed to live in the final folder. In my mind, is this the thing that went out live? So like I have one asset right now that's in our regular collection of stuff that has a list of SKUs that are available for a benefit program. That file gets updated pretty regularly. It's still the final because it's in the final folder, but I don't save the various iterations of it because I don't need the archive in that document of what those SKUs have been in the past, because there's another place that holds on to the evolution of those SKUs. So I just need the asset in the final folder to truly be the current list of usable SKUs. So it's being both rigid, but also not being too precious about what is in your final folder. So if you have something that may need to change and you're sure that you don't need a history at any point of what that change is, then change the one. I know this is a sin to say it, I'm aware of that, but change the one that is final in your final folder and launch that out. If there is any possibility that you will want a record of that change, then you take the one that was final, you drop it into the program folder, and you change final to whatever that date is, and then replace it with, have the copy that is final now in that final folder. So that's where sometimes having the date or the version is really important. And just for full clarity, where you see the version, it's v2.2. The difference between 2.1 and 2.2 are internal changes that have happened within the team. The difference between 2.3 and 3.0 is if we've sent it out to a client or we've sent it out for approvals.
Okay.
So that is more of an agency thing that I've worked on, not so much if you're part of the internal team, unless your internal team is one of those, our creative team functions like an agency, and there's a very clear line of, we send this out to the SMEs for their approvals, and then they send it back to us with their markups. You want to be able to see when changes have been made internally within the creative team and when things have been pushed out into some other team or some other world. And that, so I have definitely had V2.7, V2.9, that type of thing. If we've gone through multiple cycles internally, you don't have to have a dedicated final folder. If your system, if your team just doesn't work with that, then we are definitely have final as the last word or the first word in it within the folder, so that it's easy to see in you're looking at the list of assets that are in that folder to pick out the one that is final, make that capitalized in first, so it's easiest to mark that out.
Mm-hmm.
And then seems like we might as well also have the conversation about file naming, if there's any questions about that.
Not specifically about file naming. I've got another one about, what steps are being left out here. Anonymous writes, when it comes to establishing a traffic flow from concept to approval, what steps do you find to be commonly overlooked? So traffic flow from establishing concept to approval. Anything get left out in there in our archiving process?
Yeah, I think a lot of concepts are, the scratch paper that you don't necessarily save. And I see value in the creative process, more so with much more creative environments. If you're the ad agency that's really pushing a new concept or something like that, hold on to those notes. As even if it would be great to have those notes so that they are easily searchable, but even the worst case scenario, a snapshot of the whiteboard and drop that into the folder called concepts that are within a campaigns folder so that you have access to that later. Because again, when you're coming back around and trying to come up with the next new idea, go back in and skim through some of the concepts, the raw notes of previous brainstormings. That can help get your juices flowing, get thinking through things.
And is that the primary value in keeping, this paper trail?
Mm-hmm.
It's obviously useful to go back and see what you've actually published in the past.
Yes.
But if you're mining this archive for information, seeing the drafts that didn't make it through, the value there is, well, maybe we can take this and work it and create something new. Right. So it's just, it's a brainstorming resource. It's okay.
Yeah,
good.
Definitely a brainstorming resource. I mean, there's also a little bit of CYA. If someone comes back and says, hey, we never should have said this out in the world, and you can say, here's where you approved saying this out in the world, my dear.
Okay.
So, there's definitely a little bit of that element. And then some of that is right at the very beginning. I said something about that you are the subject matter expert for content development, but you can't necessarily be the subject matter expert for all of the subjects of all of the content that you will be producing. So you have to rely on those approvals from those subject matter experts who know that a comma misplaced might say something different than what the product actually is. And having that paper trail confirms whether or not they approved something. And not that things blow up in my face very often, but it's a much smaller blow up if you have the paper trail that shows where you engaged with people. So we'll talk a little bit about tools and processes. So one thing to remember is no software as a service, no tool can overcome a culture of disorganization. If you've got people in leadership who refuse to use the naming conventions that you've used and the folder conventions that you've used, it's going to be a struggle. And I'm sorry, I wish I could say it was better, but don't break your back looking for the next big thing to help save. If you're in a culture of disorganization, it's just going to be a little bit of extra shoveling to make sure that things stay as organized as they ought to be for you. But along with that, it's important to actually carve out dedicated organizational time and to not let other tasks poach that time. And it's an easy thing to let slide, especially in creative agencies. You're always chasing the deadlines are always hot. You're always chasing the next deadline. But if you don't regularly prioritize doing this, even if it is kind of mundane, even if it's not the dopamine hit of working on the next big fun thing, then these assets won't be available to you. These resources won't be available to you. The work that you have already done to build the assets that you've already built are not going to be as available to you to milk for your next project unless you have an easy and accessible place to put it. It's nothing more frustrating than, oh, I had this great idea or this great thing that was part of, oh gosh, what was it? Oh, what was it a part of? Let me bury the rest of my week trying to find that thing because I didn't do sufficient archiving to just be able to at least pull a thread and find the right thing. And I mean, the part of a lot of creative industries like to talk about being super nimble. And, again, when you're looking at your competition, they aren't doing this as much as they should. And the way for you to be nimble, the way for you to turn something around quickly is to have your asset management on lock. Because if it's on lock, if it's part of your workflow, you can pull from everything that you've ever done before as a company. You can hire in, you need to expand your copy team for a big campaign. You need to throw people in that have never worked on your product, never worked on your team before. If your file structure is set, if things are already clear, you're not going to have to give them 2 days to ramp up. You can give them 2 hours to ramp up because they don't have to have memorized where everything is. They can just be given a map and say, okay, when you get to a point where you need this thing, go find it here. When you get to a point of needing this thing, go find it there. And having that readily accessible map is going to save them a lot of time and headache, and you a lot of time and headache.
Absolutely.
And then some brands, of course, I'm at Microsoft, got to talk about Teams. And I admit, I actually like Teams. I know folks that will push back against that, and I respect their opinions of that. And of course, I have the all the bells and whistles version of Teams. And honestly, I think that's kind of universal for a lot of these different brands is the version that you have strongly influences your feelings of success with that. So if you're frustrated with Asana because you only have the free version of Asana, then it may not be Asana. And it may not be the right decision for your organization to buy the paid version of Asana, but knowing it may not be the brand. And I think that that's true of a lot of these. One of the things that I like about Teams, and I believe Monday.com does this as well, Eddie, let me know if I'm wrong on this, but I believe they actually do have the internal file structure as part of the project management program. Mm-hmm. So like I just borrowed this. I don't use Monday and I can't show my Teams because most of the work that I do is internal and that would be messy. So I just grabbed a screenshot from a video about Monday.com. And particularly one of the things that I wanted to show and sort of highlight is that there's an opportunity to add a link to a draft of an item within that project management structure. So whether or not that link is the link to that item, because you're actually including each step of the process includes the link to that asset, or if you utilize that as a consistent, this is the link to the folder where all of the assets of this project are held, is up to you. I don't think that it's capable of understanding what the link means any more than it being an active link. So there's an opportunity, there's a way that you can set this up so you can have the link associated with every line item. And any time that you can do that, trailing up or down as much as that link is useful for that line item make sure that you have a link, even if it seems redundant, even if you're going back in and putting the same link over and over again in multiple places, having that link always available in the task is going to make it easier. And you can see some of the, Teams, Slack, Monday, ClickUp. These are some of the ones that I've heard of, used, had varying success with. But also, I've worked with small nonprofits. They don't have the money for anything. And if a well-oiled spreadsheet is what you need, then you can actually do all of this with a well-oiled spreadsheet. So don't let the access or availability of some paid tool or service get in the way of being able to be organized and structured in your asset management. And that is it. That is my speech. I don't think that as much time as we had hoped to have answer questions, but hopefully
that's okay. That's okay. We've got a few that we will close out with. Let me just quickly promote the next of our product chat series. That one happens December 15th, 1 p.m. Eastern time. We're going to welcome Kirsten Vendetta, Senior Product Manager at LinkedIn, for a conversation on what key concepts product professionals should be focusing on to fuel their 2023, and how being ruthless in your prioritization can serve as your biggest ally. So come back with us to learn how to prioritize your 2023. And with that, okay, Sandi, I've got a couple questions. Here is one from Anonymous. Anonymous has asked, this marketing is hard enough. Hurting sales teams is much harder. These techniques can help, but in my opinion, sellers are very difficult to corral and keep on message with a minimum of picking on our poor sales team. We love those guys. They make lots of money for us. How can we convert the sales team to this idea of such an organized structure to our archives? Or should there, I'm going to throw an additional question to Anonymous. Should there be, sort of the asset archive and then sales have their own archive? Should these things be combined? Is there benefit to doing that?
To answer your second question first, in some ways that final folder can work for that. So if you have a recalcitrant sales team, then maybe they have access to the final folder and they don't have access to the other internal folders. And you just know that you're going to have to work a little bit harder to go back through and keep clean your final folder and tend to that a little bit more. And I think to answer the first part of the question, though, bring up some of the why we should do this messaging that we discussed earlier in this conversation. The best way to have your sales team buy in is to have your sales team buy in. Give them their own motivations for where these things should be. And if their habit is, oh, where's the latest XYZ? If every time you say all latest versions of all things are in this folder, here is where this is. Not to nag necessarily, but to just have that constant reminder of everything that you need is right here because we've already got this structure. Just a reminder, please help us keep this organized. Mm-hmm. And, there's a lot of, I think with those teams, because their first priority is often a rush. It's the urgency that being a salesperson means that there's an element of urgency to what they're doing. Sympathizing a little bit with that being their primary motive and nudging them into taking a moment to make sure that things are as organized as they can be and giving them that motivation.
Well, Sandi, we are about at time. I'm going to ask you one more sort of summary question here that we like to ask at the end. Are you? And I'm going to spring this on you right now with no chance to prepare at all. But if you were to suggest two things that would benefit our audience the most today, of all that we've talked about, two things that they should implement right away as the main takeaway points, what would you suggest that our audience do to help them with their asset assessment?
The first thing that I would suggest is the personal relationships, because this is the thing that you ought to do that is sometimes a challenge to do. The more buy-in you can get from the people who have influence, the easier it will be. So while you may feel like you're shouting into the cavern, hey, this needs to be done, can you get your leader? Can you get your, as a friend of mine refers to that, your grand boss, your great grand boss to buy in? Can you do this in a way that is engaging with folks? If you have access to resources to make it a friendly competition, what have you, but do the social interaction with the relevant teams to make this as useful as possible for them and as much buy-in as possible for them. Mm-hmm. And the corollary to that is try not to get too rigid. You may be in a situation in which the company culture is a much bigger mountain than you as an individual can move. Figure out how you can best utilize this organization and attention to organization with as much of how it affects your work. Maybe you end up with, well, your file structure is excellent and your organization and archiving is excellent. And you can become the go-to person when people are asking, where are the things? But you may not be able to change the entire company or the entire agency or the entire program team. And being completely intractable about this, it means that people won't come to you for these assets, and then they aren't as useful. So really, as much as this is put the blinders on and do things on your computer, the biggest help is when you're taking the blinders off and interacting with your coworkers.
There it is. There it is. I was reminded as you were speaking today of a saying from a friend of mine who was a fitness instructor who used to tell us all the time, you can't improve what you don't track.
Yeah.
Right. And that sums up the big takeaway for me, which is doing these processes only enables you with more superpowers, with more ability to improve, and it will only increase the good ideas that you're pushing out of your department, whatever that is.
Right.
Man, Sandi, you've got thanks pouring into the chat over here. People that wish they had known this stuff years ago, and that is always the measure of a successful presentation. If folks have more questions for you, where could they get a hold of you, Sandi?
Let's go back to my LinkedIn. Please, if you do send me a link request with LinkedIn, please reference this. I do get enough LinkedIn requests that have nothing to do with me, who I am, where I'm going, or the planet that I live on. So absolutely, please say something about this presentation if you send me a link request. But I'm happy to answer questions through LinkedIn.
There you go. #pragmatic. We'll throw it in there. That'll work. That'll work.
Exactly.
Sandi, it has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for your advice. I feel smarter having listened to you today, and I'm sure that the audience says the same as well. I look forward to having you back sometime in the future. Let's do it again real soon. And to our audience out there, have a fantastic rest of your week. Join us again next time, December 15th, when we'll do this again. Thank you all.